Welcome to Cluster Compare. If you're going to be making notes, please write the following headings: speaker, situation, structure, poetic device, language device, context, and the poems that we're going to be looking at today are Poppies and Kamikaze. So let's begin. The speaker that Weir creates in Poppies is one that is a parent and who has, throughout the poem, an emotive and nostalgic tone. That nostalgia can be seen in a line which says, "like we did when you were little." There is the idea that there is a special connection, a camaraderie between the two, the mother and the son, that was held in the past and that she remembers quite clearly. The speaker in Kamikaze has a moment of nostalgia, but actually begins the poem with a rather aloof tone, speaking about the father in the third person. And her nostalgia only is evident when she recalls the nostalgia of her father, which caused him to return home. Now, in Poppies, or rather in Kamikaze, that nostalgia is when she notes, yes, grandfather's boat. And it's the idea that she then sees her attachment to her father in talking to her children. If we look at the situation, the one created in Poppies is where this mother, who as we know has been shown as this quite emotive person, recounts the moment that she sees her son off to war. It's a moment that is quite powerful in how intensely she recalls little tiny details. And then there is the other situation towards the end of the poem where she releases a dove, and then she finds herself at a graveside in which there is a memorial that she leans against. These situations help to identify a person struggling with the situation she has found herself in, being alone without her son. The situation in Kamikaze is a speaker who is recounting almost step by step the process by which her father left to go on a suicide mission, considered his family and its relevance to him, and then returned home. In conveying this situation, she manages to insert the importance attached to the people that made him change his decision, just as we gather a glimpse of the importance her father had to her with the nostalgic moment that she shared. If we look at the structure of Poppies, what we see is 4 stanzas of varying length, with the first and last stanzas matching in size. And if we look at the content of each stanza, stanza 1 sets the context, the background to what is occurring in this person's life. Stanza 2 reveals the relationship. Stanza 3 exposes her sense of loss and the imbalance in her life without her son. And stanza 4 ends the poem with her desires and hopes. We have the word traced at the very end of the stanza, where she almost attempts, if we look at the meaning of that word, to copy her son back into her life. If we look at the structure of Kamikaze, we have quite a few stanzas there, and what's interesting is that almost all the stanzas begin with a connective or a conjunction of some sort, mostly the word and sometimes the word but. And it is the idea that there is additional information that you need to know to give some sense to the events that took place, sense that perhaps she didn't have, or the family and community didn't have at the time it occurred. If we look at poetic devices in Poppies, and we look specifically at enjambment in this case, and the line in Poppies, "as I walked," and it breaks at that point and continues with the second line, "with you." Now, when we look at enjambment, we know we are looking at that end word on the first line. So walked gives the impression, breaking there gives the impression that she is trying to slow down time, make the most of the few seconds, the moments that she has with the son. Beginning the second line with the word with, because she didn't say beside, which would give us positioning of her and her son. She said with. There is that suggestion of togetherness, that unity that has been alluded to throughout the poem. If we look at poetic device in Kamikaze, we can identify the same enjambment. If we take a look, the use of enjambment quite often throughout the poem. And what we have, if we take a look at stanza 2, where she says, recounting later to her children, he must have looked far down. The idea that children is what we are focused on at the end of the first line, and we know becomes quite a powerful tool, family, and the fact that there is the pause and the break there makes us understand that this would become an integral part of the choice that he made. Moving to our other heading, language device. In Poppies, there is a lexical field of war, a lexical field of conflict. So there are the words like war, blockade, armistice, spasms, and each of these words create a paradox, a juxtaposition inserted into a poem which is quite soft and tender and quite emotive. And there is the idea that conflict does this, that conflict interrupts the unity, the comfort, the loving relationships, and actually splits that and separates them with what it brings. If we look at the language device used particularly in Kamikaze, and we think about, I would say, the use of pronouns here, something simple. The idea that she begins the poem with her father, and your very first reading of the poem would not associate you directly with thinking about the speaker talking about her own father, but rather somebody else's father. And it is this idea of distance with the use of pronouns in the poem that really helps to demonstrate and reveal the distance created by the decision the father made, the distance created between him and his family and him and his community. Finally, if we look at context, the heading there, and in Poppies, the reference to Armistice Sunday is made at the beginning of the poem, the very first line. And we recognize that this is the, if you like, remembrance of the fallen soldiers. It is the idea that the poem begins with this contextual feature of this tradition held in society. And beginning with this idea helps us to understand that potentially this mother is in the very same position as millions of people around the world, remembering her fallen son. It's never directly stated, but the allusion with the contextual feature at the beginning is there. If we look at the context for Kamikaze, we understand that the role of the suicide pilot at that time was considered a role of honor. It brought honor not just to the pilot, but to the family. And in turning around and actually forsaking his role, he brought dishonor not just on himself, but actually on the family that had spurred him to make the decision to turn around. Therein, if you like, lies the great irony of the decision he made. But understanding the context helps us to understand how difficult a decision that must have been for him, but also how important his family was to him for him to make that decision. That's the end of that cluster comparison. I hope you can do what you can with the information you've been given.